Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think we're going to kick off, but shall we put the video up? Yeah? Thanks. And then I'll just introduce the panel and the topic.
Climate change is a global challenge that doesn't differentiate between developed and undeveloped economies.
It is not a government problem. It is not a business problem. It's each and every one of us problem.
COP28 is very important for us because it provides us a good opportunity to benchmark some of the work that we are doing in the bank to ensure that we come up with sustainable programs that help to make sure that we're able to mitigate negative implications of climate change. Number two is that also what it does, it gives us an opportunity as a bank to showcase some of the good work that is being done in all the markets where we are doing business. And thirdly, also just to collaborate and bring great ideas that exist globally so that we can push the boundaries and ensure that we come up with sustainable long-term impact around some of the challenges that we see in the planet.
The biggest outcome that the COP28 should actually achieve is one where we start to address in a just and equitable way some of the challenges that we face as a continent. And in particular, if we look across the continent, I mean, we've got a significant opportunity of beginning to really address in the right way the energy poverty that we have.
The social aspect of net zero is very critical to us because the success for net zero is not only to achieve it by 2050, but to achieve it without negative impact on the society for Africa.
We're quite clear that we cannot leave our communities behind. That's why we prescribe and subscribe to the notion of a just transition.
And it's quite important that the African continent speak for itself, that we speak for ourselves, and as an organization we want to add our voice.
Through the ecosystem approach, we must work together, engage each other, if in fact challenge each other with regards to how much progress we're making. And then by so doing, my view is that we'll come up with better plans that are sustainable, that can really make a meaningful difference over time. We can only become better at this piece of work that is being done around climate change.
So it is therefore important for everyone across the globe, whether be it governments, be it business, or be it individuals, we all have to start coming together and solving this challenge in a holistic fashion.
Okay. Welcome everybody. My name is Salim Fakir. I'm the director of the African Climate Foundation. My job is really just to facilitate this discussion, and I'll say a little bit about it now. I've been working with the APSA team to try to develop a conversation around the role of private banks in the just transition, and basically try to understand this not only in terms of the fact that APSA has a presence across the African continent, but try to also give a picture of not only the work in South Africa, but also outside of South Africa. So I think the main reason for this is that now that we have the Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan, there's been a couple of billion raised of public finance from bilateral funders. There's a lot of discussion internally within the South African government that is working on the JETP to look at the role of commercial or private finance. Just about 2 weeks ago, the Presidential Climate Commission produced a report on climate finance. And I think because of the maturity of the South African market, it's very clear that commercial finance and private finance is very strong in South Africa. Over the last 3 years, there has been 91% of the climate finance has come from private sources. Only about 9% is really from public sector. And when I talk about public sector, I mean also the government and foreign governments. In fact, there's a mythology that the JETP is run by foreign governments. Is not true, actually. Actually, foreign contributions are very small. And from the conversations with APSA and my participation in a number of other meetings, there's still a question of how much of the private finance from both commerce and private equity can be brought on board to support the delivery of the implementation plan. And in order to help us with that, we have some really excellent speakers from different parts of Africa, and also one person from a sister organization who I'll introduce just now. Works a lot on this, but works in Senegal on some of these issues. So let me just briefly introduce the panelists. Joanne Yawich, you must be tired from talking about the JETP and the investment plan, but Joanne Yawich is the head of the Just Energy Transition Project Management Unit, and has been responsible for pulling together the JETP investment plan. Khalifa Sarr, although he's replacing Amadou Hott, the former Minister of Finance for Senegal, he is not pretty face, but he has done a lot of work in this area. He is a special envoy for the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. They just signed an MOU about a day ago. Sorry? Oh, you head his office. Sorry. So the head of the office of the special envoy. Sorry. But he has also worked. Khalifa was also appointed director of cabinet, the chief of staff of the minister of finance? In July 2020. But he's worked across the whole of West Africa, or quite a few places in West Africa. I'm not going to go through his whole CV, but I know Khalifa very well because we work with him in Senegal, we work with Ajia, and we've also sought his and Amadou Hott's advice on how to do things in Senegal. So I'm really pleased that he's here. And then Siddharth Pathak, Director of Partnerships at the 250 Pathways platform of the European Climate Foundation. They have been doing a lot of analysis of countries that can achieve decarbonization ambition, also look at the costing and the kind of finance and capital needed to make that successful. He says in his CV, his expertise lies in navigating complex questions related to climate change choices. Before joining the 2050 Pathway platform, he was the head of political advocacy at CAN International, and also worked at Greenpeace. Then we have my good friend Priscilla, who showed me how to get to the green zone this morning and how to bypass all the blue zone traffic. And so just to thank her, I know her as a colleague who works in Eskom Treasury, very active in the climate finance space. She's a chartered development finance analyst, and works on sustainable finance at Eskom Treasury. Brilliant experience, also very involved in the Komati project and looking at financing of that under the Clean Investment Fund. So really fantastic that you could step in a short notice, Priscilla. So lovely to have you here. And then last person, and I want to do away with with all the CVs. Msizi Koza, Head of Environmental, Social and Governance at APSA Group. I met him on Zoom and he looks exactly the same as he is here. And also comes with a electrical engineering degree, and has 12 years of financial services and management consulting experience. So I will ask him to say something on behalf of APSA, also contribute on the panel discussion. Yeah. And also make some concluding remarks on behalf of APSA. I put you on the spot now. So I'm going to kick off with perhaps a question to Joanne, and just to try to also get your reflections on where you sit as a PMU. What are the opportunities for bringing on board private finance? What are the hurdles you're seeing, and both from the point of view of the government and the private sector? You've also been the CEO of NBI, so you know all of the characters very well, and they were your members. So maybe we can kick off with you, and I know you have to leave at 3 o'clock, so yeah, thanks.
Okay. And apologies for that, my real sincere apologies. One of our team has had to, at very short notice, fly home, so we've had to pick up his meetings. So maybe just to talk a little bit about the work that we've done with the private sector. So in the process of doing the investment plan, we did a round of all of the South African banks in 2022, and basically asked them what they thought their contribution could be to the JET. And the figure that is in the investment plan and in the implementation plan of around 500 billion from the private sector going primarily into the electricity sector comes really out of that round. This year we did it again. And although I don't think the numbers have changed, I think that the overarching energy sector reforms have made a very big difference in terms of the private sector seeing opportunities to invest in the renewable sector and in infrastructure. But I think importantly, there is an overwhelming interest from the private sector in investing in transmission. And we're going to talk about the transmission grid later on this afternoon. We had a round table at the Africa Climate Week in Nairobi, just to gauge the kind of interest that there would be, primarily from international private capital, but also from domestic financiers and from the long-term insurers, which I think is very important in terms of long-term investment in infrastructure. I think that the conversation that we have to start to have with the private sector in a much more focused way is a conversation really about the just and how it is that the banks have enormous leverage. I think it's important to just recognize the level of leverage that the banks have over what happens. And I think that that leverage can and should be being used much more effectively in order to support and promote and create the opportunities for the just side of the transition to be financed, and for the bank's clients to be, in the way that they are structuring their projects and the investments that they are coming to the banks with, to be able to take that into account in that structuring and to look at the kind of this ability to leverage. And I think that if we could be having that conversation, as well as a conversation around how commercial capital, concessional capital and philanthropic capital could be working together in blended ways to actually support the just, that we would really be moving forward much faster than we are at the moment. So I think this is a real opportunity space, and I think it's going to mean a real willingness to put heads together and come up, and I think it's a collaborative space. I think importantly, I see it, I mean, you know, kind of having been in the NBI, there is the commercial space, but then you have to be able to say, without breaching competition rules, what are the kinds of things that one really can work with others on in order to take a set of social goods options forward? And I think maybe this is a space to do it. So let me stop there, but I think that just as a start to the conversation. Thanks.
I'd like to explore one or two things further, because I know you're leaving at 3. In order to bring about sort of the just label into the commercial finance and to enable it to count as contributing to the delivery of the JETP, what are the thoughts currently of the PMU of how to make that happen? And number 2, what is the outlook in the next 3 years for private finance, particularly around the investment plan, the implementation plan?
Okay, so I think that I think the one breakthrough that we do need is a decision on an approach to whether and how private investment can be mobilized for the grid. And I think that that in turn is going to open the way for a whole set of projects across the country that are sitting in the pipelines and waiting for investment. So I think that is the one side of the issue of the outlook for private capital. I mean, there's a 66 gigawatt pipeline of private renewable projects in the country, and we want to see them all happen. So I think we've got to work very hard around that. I think that secondly, on the question of how we embed the just, it's a two-sided thing. I think the one is about the structuring of deals and projects, and a set of measures and indicators that really need to be set and agreed to, that that in the way those projects are structured get delivered. So I mean, that is the one side of it. And I think it means, I mean, earlier on today we were talking about co-creation and collaboration. I think it means more of that than we've done up until now. So that's the one side of it. The second side of it, I think, is something that I want to go back to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development's Vision 2050 that they put on the table a couple of years ago. And essentially what they were saying is, if we're going to have by 2050 9 billion people on the planet, what is it that we need to do in order to ensure that all of them have a good quality of life? And what they then identified the role of business as being was to say, how does business provide the products, the services, the commodities that service 9 billion people in ways that work for them? And, you know, part of it, we talk about the bottom of the pyramid or whatever it is, but I think in the context of the just transition, we really need to work out what it is that the banking sector should be doing in terms of the products and services that are going to support the intentions of a just transition. We need some programs that really provide the financing base for the rollout of renewables to lower income households in South Africa. It's critical. It's a critical inequality issue that we have to address. The banks are increasingly lending into the middle and upper income market in relation to embedded generation and solar. We don't have many programs that allow the bottom end of the market to happen. And so we do need to de-risk it. We do need to do this through a blended finance approach. But I also think that there needs to be a will to take it forward. So I think that's just an example of kind of two kinds of ways that I think we can work together. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Khalifa. I know you've been working very hard on establishing a GIA. Maybe you want to say a little bit about that. Give a sense of private finance space and trends on the continent, the way you see it. You may want to talk a little bit about Senegal and opportunities there. One of the findings of the CPI report showed that there's a lot more foreign public finance and some national public finance in Africa, but very little on private finance in Africa. And I just wanted your views on that. And have you talked to commercial banks, private equity firms, and just insights? You don't need to answer it, you know, but just I know you've been working on this for a while, so just some thoughts on it. I think your microphone is on. Huh? Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. No, so first, thank you very much, Salim, for the opportunity to speak at this panel. I would like to have three main points regarding your questions. The first one is just a broader picture to say that I think in Africa we need to look at the transition to net zero less like a need but more like an opportunity. We have abundant resources for renewable energy that enable us to produce green hydrogen and to export or to build a green industry on the continent that could be financed by the commercial banks. We have critical minerals that enable us to scale up in the global value chain and produce what the world needs for the transition. So really we have to start thinking about the green transition as an economic opportunity for the continent to create jobs, to scale up in the value chain. Now, coming specifically to your questions about the private sector and overall financing for the transition to net zero, it's true that what Africa is currently receiving as climate finance is almost nothing compared to our needs. We have about 20 billion per year climate finance, whereas our need is $2.8 trillion until 2030 to achieve the country's NDC, which means that we need to scale up public and concessional financing. It is needed. When we talk about the just part of the transition, concessional money needs to be there. That's for sure. But we also need to scale up the private capital. Now, what we have seen on the continent is that there is strong appetite by the private sector, local and international, to finance projects. When you are in the investment fund, for example, you would see many competitors when projects are construction ready or close to reach financial close that fight to get the deal. Because Africa, despite whatever is said, offers one of the best risk-adjusted return on the continent. Private sector come, ask for political risk insurance, partial risk guarantee, sovereign guarantee, all the package that is needed to make the deal very attractive for them and still get double-digit IRR. They don't have it anywhere else in the world. So there's appetite. But the problem is how to get those projects from ideas, from pipeline, up to financial close. We need money to bridge that gap so that the private sector can invest. And speaking about AGIA, this is what we're trying to do. AGIA is the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. It was launched last year at COP27 by the African Development Bank, the African Union Commission, and Africa 50. And the goal is to raise 500 million blended capital, grants, junior equity, senior equity, for project preparation and project development. The goal is to work with the private sector to invest in very early stage in green infrastructure project up to financial close. Then we exit, we leave it to commercial banks, DFIs, private investors to take up the deal and construct and execute. We are looking to unlock a 10 billion pipeline of green infrastructure by providing this early stage capital. And I'm very happy to report that with the support of the African Development Bank, the Special Envoy, Mr. Amadou Hart, we were able, and Africa 50 African Union Commission, we were able to secure 175 million for the first close. There's more to come over the next months, but we hope to reach a first close sign in early 24 with at least half of this money. And then coming just on the just part, I think it's really important when we think about regulation, ESG impact for the commercial banks, for their clients, to think about that for Africa, it has to be progressive. If it's not progressive, if you are asking the industries, the companies on the ground to be green as soon as now, then you just destroy the few jobs that you have on the continent, and we're not using the green transition as opportunity to create more jobs. So it has to be progressive, we have to provide technical assistance to both the government and the local private sector for the government to build the right framework to enable greening the economic space, but also for the private sector to do the R&D that is needed and to scale up to reach the green level that is needed to achieve transition to net zero. I'll stop here.
Ifa, can I ask you just one more question, if you don't mind? And sorry, I'm going to do this with all the panelists. In your conversations with private banks, are they domestic banks, or are they domestic banks foreignly owned, or are they foreign banks who are looking for opportunities? And how does that differentiation affect the thinking around project risk and opportunities?
Well, I mean, for now, Agia, we at very early stage, but in general, when you speak to, Agia focuses on early stage of projects, right? But in general, speaking about your points, I think when you speak to local banks, at least in the WAM region, it's very tough to get them to commit for a long maturity, right? For project finance, you need lenders to provide 15 years door-to-door, 18 years door-to-door loans. But in the WAM region, it's very tough to get local currency for like more than 10 years. So it's number one, and you have strong regulation that prevent them to take some risk. And this is fair. I mean, we don't expect the commercial banks to take the same risk as the FIs, for example. Of course, if the bank is owned by a foreign entity, perhaps it means that they have a bigger portfolio. It may not be the case for South Africa, but it's the case in some region in WAMU. So you have a stronger firepower, but still you need to comply with regulations. So it's really important to de-risk the opportunities. And I think that, it's important to insist on that and to be realistic on the private sector. We cannot expect them to take certain risks. They have to comply with Basel II, Basel III, 4, and so on and so forth. We have to, and this is the role of MDBs, philanthropes, donors countries, to provide the resources that are needed for the commercial bank to come. We cannot ask the commercial bank to be here from day one.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Msizi, if you don't mind. In terms of Absa Bank, you South African-based commercial bank that is now moving across the continent. I can't remember the exact stats, but you may want to say where you work. And just to try to get a sense of the feel from the thinking on the just transition work in South Africa, but also what the opportunities are outside of South Africa, and which countries do you see great opportunities to unlock more investments? And if you are the leading bank, do you provide the platform for other commercial banks to come into this space? Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Salim, and very good afternoon to all of the colleagues who've joined us here and those online. No, so you are right, but maybe before I give you those two perspectives, right? So maybe just to outline at a very strategic level, right? What is our strategic approach to these questions? The first point to be made here is, we've made a choice that we want to be an active force for good across the continent. So what does that mean? That means we've taken a stand across three broad platforms in terms of our ESG strategy. Number one is financial inclusion. The second one is diversity and inclusion. And the third is what we call positive climate action. So maybe to echo your words, Khalifa, we've got a couple of core fundamental beliefs. The first of those beliefs is that the transition to a net zero economy holds much promise for the continent. So the view is we shouldn't be seeing this from the perspective of only looking at its downsides, and sure there are downsides to a disorderly transition in particular, but the opportunity set is very rich and very broad. And the second fundamental belief is around the fact that, you have to avoid a disorderly transition at all costs, but not at the cost of inaction. Because, as you were mentioning earlier, there's $2.9 trillion that are going to be required, right, over the next 20 or 30 odd years. And so we think, and our view is that we see this very much as it's a potential for reset, for growth, and for innovation for our clients as well as our communities. And as Joanne mentioned a bit earlier, I mean, I think as we look at the opportunity, especially if you look at renewable energy, right, which is a key growth lever, which is a key decarbonization lever. It's become a very commoditized space, actually. So there is incredible competition, even amongst the big commercial banks. And so, there has to be a role, I think, even as you think about facilitating a just transition, there has to be a role for especially the multilateral development banks, who in my opinion, need to move further up the risk curve in order to, especially as you get into the smaller scale projects, in order to get the more commercial and private capital to come into the mix. We need to move further up the risk curve in order to crowd in kind of that private sector capital. So I think that that's an important piece. The World Bank released a report around the reforms of multilateral development banks, and it had a really striking number and statistic. It said for every $1 of funding that comes from multilateral banks, it's only 30 cents of private capital that gets unlocked. Now that equation should be the other way around. Right? It should be 30 cents from MDBs or multilateral banks, and then crowding in a much larger portion of private capital. And I think there's lots there, and the initiatives that you've just spoken about, I think, begin to move the debate and the discussion sort of in the right direction. I mean, I think the other point about this as well, Salim, is and it was interesting that Joanne was making this point around the fact that one of the unintended consequences is both in the large commercial, project finance side, but also as you go further down the curve from a complexity perspective, is, when you think about this transition, is that it could actually spark and even worsen levels of inequality. All right, and interestingly, we've just done a really interesting transaction in Kenya, where we provided support to a client whose main job or whose main business model is to provide, solar solutions, almost rent-to-own kind of solar solutions, but specifically aimed at, very low middle income countries and families in Kenya. So I think you need those kinds of models to come more and more to the fore, and you need banks in particular to understand the risks a bit more, because if I'm being honest, we also sometimes struggle and trip ourselves up around some of these questions. So I think the banks themselves, we need to challenge ourselves and look at ourselves in the mirror a little bit more around that. But I think those kinds of deals begin to help in terms of creating precedents as well. I mean, let me pause there. I mean, I'm sure there'll be broader discussions as well.
I'm sure when we get to the audience, there'll be more. So I want to go to Priscilla. Priscilla, you've doing a PhD on sustainable finance and blended finance, but you also work in the Treasury at Eskom, and you worked on Komati. I was curious as to the lessons you were learning in terms of the intermingling, if I may put it that way, between public and private finance, and what are the issues that you see. And Eskom can't borrow at the moment. There's a moratorium. How are we going to unlock finance for projects, particularly the grid, and more projects on 1,800 megawatts? Maybe you want to update people on how that opportunity has evolved. So, if I can hand over to you, thanks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, starting there on the embargo on the debt relief for Eskom, we obviously forced to look for alternative ways of funding. we've always, funded on balance sheets, and we had to look at alternative ways. Now we are busy with triple P framework that we are developing with the infrastructure fund and the DBSA. And in looking at that, it's because that, I was saying on the round table yesterday that I've got an unfair advantage because I've negotiated with, a lot of different banks. So I've got a helicopter view. So with the DFIs, obviously on that helicopter view, you see the challenges and you see the opportunities. So there's a lot of opportunities where the private sector can, assist in terms of reaching the net zero together with the DFIs. And in terms of, other things they are doing, they're investing in green loans, for businesses that, interested in sustainable technologies. They are already funding the IPPs, to scale up the renewable. But what is still lacking and what the private sector can improve on is this collaboration with the DFIs. So other examples I can put where they can issue a bond, and then the DFIs have a lot of appetite to buy those bonds. So on the basis of the pipeline, and there is a pipeline, if I can say, if you look at the pipeline, in terms of ESCOM, there is a pipeline. So there is also that, appetite from the DFIs to buy those bonds from the private sector. So in that way, the project will be funded, and the commercial banks will go into a space or sector that they wouldn't normally go. And also the DFIs will be able to demonstrate additionality. And other ways in terms of innovating, we're looking at some, I'll just make an example of Tubatse Hydro that we're looking to take to market by the way of triple P. Obviously, the DFIs assist in terms of developing the project to bankability, and then the private sector can step in terms of the developing the commercial part. And that's where then that triple P model is important on, in terms of them then stepping in and developing that. And then that is on the off balance sheet side. But what is important also that we see, and we saw also with Komati, is that there's a new class of capital in terms of transition finance that the commercial banks can also step into. We know that climate finance is very crucial, for the transition, but it's not sufficient. And the traditional and conventional streams of funding are also not enough. So this new set, class of capital has a potential to fill in the gap in terms of the funding gap where the climate finance cannot reach, and has a potential, actually, they spoke about the institution reforms here. In terms of the dominant finance regime, it has a potential as a niche as a finance niche to disrupt the dominant, regime, and actually fill in that gap of funding that is required. Because what you must understand is that we are still transitioning to green, so there's a lot of money for green, but there's no much funds for the journey. So the journey to green, that I'm talking about, transition finance can finance, can fill. So I think the commercial banks, if they can step into that also.
Thank you. That's very
Yeah.
insightful. Siddharth, you've done lots of 250 pathways.
Right.
They could just be paper. How did you solve the finance issues in delivering this? And you can just speak a little bit about more your work across Africa,
Sure.
but also internationally, and just some of the debates you are looking at. Thanks.
No, thanks, Salim, and thanks for having me here. I think overall, just to sort of give a bit of a sense on what the 2050 Pathways platform does, we basically work directly with governments to support them on doing long-term strategies around climate change, with the goal to sort of achieve decarbonization at a point in time where they feel comfortable. So it's not a 2050, even though the name has it, but for many countries, this is beyond 2050. The idea is to sort of support countries and build national capacities to actually undertake some of this work. And this is not just technical work, but also qualitative work, primarily of getting a lot of stakeholders together and getting a consensus around what that transition pathway looks like. Within this piece of work, we worked quite closely with quite a number of African countries. We've now operationally have had work with Morocco, Mauritania is starting, Senegal, Gambia, Nigeria, Tanzania, some work with South Africa. So there is quite a lot of work across, and very different, of course, experiences at large. But I think the last point Priscilla made is quite important, and it sort of is an interesting thread across the panel, which is that while climate change from our perspective is always about opportunities, it's not a zero-sum game. There will be people who will lose out, and that's where the just part of it comes into play. And when I say it's not just people, but also maybe industries that'll have to reshape or repurpose for a new journey or a new transition. And I think that that's quite a central piece of the puzzle where both sides are equally supported. It looks very shiny on the opportunity side, so it is but obvious for a lot of capital to go for the shiny things. But just because it's shiny doesn't mean, in terms of the political economy of the country, I think people who will be needing much more of a hand in terms of that journey will require some type of support, which then sort of pedals back in our sort of circumstances. In many of the discussions that we've had, there is a crucial discussion about role, and particularly role of private capital, the MDBs, the role of public finance from the national budget, the role of ODA, and who has what risk capacities and appetites, plus also who is willing to come in. Because I think that in many cases, there is a bit of a fight around the project pipeline and those projects that are ready across these number of sort of sources, if I was to call them that. And that's not very healthy, because whatever looks the most profitable or whatever feels has the highest ROI is what a lot of people end up going in for, and many of the other issues are sort of left behind, including many of the issues that are quite central in terms of the just bit of it, whether it's about getting people inside and inclusion, whether it's about governance, which is often times sort of missed out. So I think it's quite valuable to sort of think about that role. And I think for us, within the process of the long-term strategy and within the process of developing a plan, that role becomes quite central in terms of the discussion, so that everybody sees where they can contribute progressively in the journey, and where is it that the government, or where is it that the government feels that they need support in. And this is not just a story in the South African context, but I had a conversation yesterday with the Indonesians, and that's a very similar discussion there as well, where PLN is struggling to find finance or capital for transition, because they are thinking of coal flex, and whatever people might have a view on that, the frank reality is they want to try and transition, but nobody is really willing to give them a hand to do that. So I think it's something that will sort of happen in many countries to go, and I think it's quite valuable to think of it from a process point of view of how different sources can come together, and at least there could be some sort of a discussion about roles, which could be very valuable for countries to sort of generate some capital.
Can I ask the panelists if you want to say any reflections on what has been said, any comments before I open it up to the floor?
Yeah, yeah. So maybe just one additional kind of insight, and yeah, it's come up in the discussion here is, yeah, obviously South Africa has, you know, a green taxonomy, right? And I think one of the important, and I'm not saying that this is the panacea to all of the problems, but no, not the problems, but a panacea to accelerating, especially kind of transition finance in particular, is you know, a policy framework, much like we have a green taxonomy, to then have a transition finance taxonomy that is specific for SA as well. I know it's an evolving space, but I definitely think that that is one potential kind of unlock to really then get the banks to be comfortable around you know, labeling certain transactions as transition finance, because, you know, you're always worried about greenwashing and so I think that is definitely, I think, one potential quick win, as it were.
Anybody else? And then I'm going to open.
Yeah. So also, I just want to add that there's divestment, as we all know, in terms of non-coal policies. There's a divestment in terms of, you know, funding coal, and also funding something that is related to coal, meaning that now the journey, when you are not green yet, most of the DFIs and the commercial banks, they see it as, you know, they will be seen to be funding something related to coal. So if there's divestment, there's no funds you can tap into to immediately transition. So, and we are fast tracking the net zero. So that's why it's important that as we're looking at divestment, at the same time, we try to patch that gap really with the transition finance to make sure that we fast track the net zero.
Thank you. Khalifa? Yeah.
Yeah, just adding on what Siddharth said, and I couldn't agree more when he said that, you know, we need to identify partners and have each of them to say which class of investment they can intervene in. This is great, but I think it's important to know that this is the country's job to do it. Partners will not come say, well, I can get 15% return here, but instead I'm giving you grant. No, it doesn't. I mean, that's why it's important to provide early technical assistance to countries to build their strategy, to identify their reforms, their projects, identify partners, so that when they go to the table, they can sit and say, hi, I want you to invest, to give me grants into this, or to invest junior equity, senior equity into that. Now I'm getting pressure because my boss arrived.
I'm going to give him a task later, so I'm glad he came. But what I want to do is welcome Amadou Hot. Okay. So can I open up the floor for any questions? We got about 15, 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more. Any questions?
Marco Funk, the CEO of decarb.earth. So if you think of where do you get the most impact and where do you get the best returns, Africa is a very clear, like, look, Namibia, for example, has got the highest solar radiation of any country in the world, if I'm not mistaken. And then South Africa has got a very dirty grid, and other countries in Africa have a very dirty grid. So actually, Africa is the clearest opportunity on the planet for renewables. It's similar to mobile phones, where you just bypassed telephones and went to mobile phones. We could really, you know, as Africans, I know, even though I'm a white boy, I'm also an African. We could switch over and actually basically be the main showers of how it's done. Do you think that the main issue might actually be the transparency in terms of the flow of funds to these projects, as well as the showcasing of the impact? Do you think that might be like one of the core issues, or what would you say if you really had to like select a single core issue as to why that is, I know there's often a multitude of them. What would you think that is as to why Africa isn't right now already there? I'm very confident it will go there, but that we aren't showing those returns and showing that impact which we would be capable of doing.
I'm just going to take two more questions if the panelists can just also just note in. Any other questions? I have a question. Everybody talks about carbon markets. Solution or not? So I just maybe want somebody to respond to that. Any questions from the floor? Okay, anybody wants to respond to the two questions?
So on this one, I think appropriate funding models are important for us, and the needs, I think, are unique for Africa. So if you look at the West and the South, so I think we need funding, models that are fit for purpose, that talks to where we are, because as countries, we're starting on different levels. So on our side, I think what is causing more issues is that the matching of the funding models, that are fit for purpose. Like I was saying, that if you are here, you can't be given green when you're not green yet, right? You must be given something to take you to green. So I think the DFIs, the private banks must look at innovative models, including the result-based models, where you incentivize the decarbonization in terms of making sure that they're linked to milestones and all that. So I think we need more innovation. So with more innovation, I think it can fast track.
Khalifa, do you want to respond to any of the questions?
Well, perhaps a couple of points for your question, and then on the carbon market. I think your point is how we can unlock these opportunities, because Africa has a lot of opportunities for the transition to net zero. And I think my first point would be that we need to reflect the proper image and story of Africa. Africa has one of the lowest project finance default across the globe. So when we talk to investors, they see risk, risk, risk. But the reality is Africa is delivering financially on those projects. So fix the risk perception is number one. Number two, for us, African, I think we have to do the work that we need to do to make these opportunities visible and attractive to the investors. It requires the right political and regulatory framework. It requires to do what AGIA is trying to do, which is to mobilize money for project preparation and for project development, so that the projects can be ready to attract capital, right? I think that's what I want to say on your question. And on the carbon market, Salim, I think carbon market can be a solution depending on what's the price, who will pay for it, but also who will receive the money. If there is a carbon market where Africa companies pay the fair amount, depending on where we are, taking into consideration that Africa has not been polluting a lot over the last years, but Africa can receive part of that money to scale up in the value chain and to green its value chain, then I think it can be a solution.
You want to say anything, Sir?
On the first question, in terms of, well, I'm not from Africa, but the thing is that I also feel extremely uncomfortable about homogenizing so many different diversity of Africa into Africa. Like if somebody says I'm Asian, sure, I am Asian, but I'm Indian. So for me, I think that's the next thing that's going to start happening, and all is already happening in the African continent, which is there is a national identity, and every country has slightly different circumstances. And I totally agree with Khalifa. There is an image that needs to be shed and a new image built. It'll take some time, but I feel like there are a lot of interesting stories that need to be conveyed outside from across the continent, and not just to homogenize the continent, because I feel like that bundles the problem together, and many countries don't have that problem. When you say Africa has this problem, many countries in Africa don't have the problem. So it creates an impression that, like it amplifies the problem, or it amplifies certain things. So to me, as an outsider, and I would count myself as an outsider on the African sort of continent, I feel there is a need to sort of unpack that, and I think tell the story, the positive stories that are happening, but also equally recognize there are governance questions that need to be addressed. There are issues of transparency that will be addressed, but it's not like every country has to do that. And many countries are doing excellent job on transparency, excellent job on governance, which is sort of, hid or are hidden behind all the other things that people perceive as a risk in many cases. And I think on carbon markets, my only question is safeguard. Great tool. How do you really safeguard? How do you create safeguards, whether it's on environmental safeguards or whether it's on social safeguards? It's an interesting tool to get the process moving, but a lot of examples have not necessarily been great, particularly on safeguard. Even if you take into account one of the better systems, or ETS, in the European context, there are so many issues around leakages. Then especially for countries that are developing, where there is a hesitation to have maximum transparency because of historical reasons, that could pose a risk for carbon markets, where there are leakages or there are issues that are hard to sort of navigate through because of the very underlying structure in the countries. But
Can I invite one or two more questions, and then I'm going to ask Mzizi to make some concluding remarks, since you're the hostess. EPSA. I don't know, Amadou, if you want to. No? Sure. Okay. He's covered the ground. Yes, please. Microphone.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for interesting insights you have shared. My name is Kapwila. I'm from Zambia. I noticed being at the COP, we have had a lot of good developments. I think this has been good progress, especially when you look at issues relating to loss and damage. I think there's some commitment which has been made, but there was also slow progress in terms of eradicating fossil fuels. And it seems you can raise the conspiracy theory and say they gave you money to shut up so that they can continue polluting the air with fossil fuels. But again, in the same venue, I can challenge everyone. Everybody came with a plane. There's no electric plane. So how do we balance in this just transition? I'm sure without action, it's not possible. But how do we ensure that we do not create inequality, but we make the right progress, and Africa, who's the least pollutant in this whole scheme of things, benefits, and with people from the development banks, commercial banks at all, what are we doing to change that aspect? Because sometimes we look at a situation where if you're number one to drive sustainability or this ESG agenda or sustainable financing, you are likely to face the greatest loss, because some parties are not all involved, or transparency is not really there in whatever is happening. I don't know what your reactions. I know it's loaded, but I think it's something to take away by everyone. Thank you.
Any other comments? Otherwise, I'm going to ask for any final comments from the panel, and then ask Mzizi to provide conclusions. Yeah. Anybody want to respond to? No?
Yeah, so
He did
maybe
say it was
just,
loaded questions.
yeah, maybe just to touch on what he's saying. It's important, I think, to pace ourselves. Like I said, we're facing different challenges. So it's important that we balance in terms of, if I can talk about South Africa. In South Africa, we've got security issues, right? Energy security issues. It's important to balance the affordability, the security, and the sustainability. So when I'm saying we pace ourselves, not necessarily we commit, we all want to get there to the net zero, but we pace ourselves depending on our circumstances to make sure that we're balancing, the energy trilemma that the whole world is grappling with.
Excellent. Khalifa, no.
But perhaps just say that, and I fully agree with you that, when you think about phasing out fossil fuel, which is the goal of everyone, I think everyone wants to phase out fossil fuel, but you need to think about the 600 million people that don't have access to electricity on the continent. You need to think about, millions of women that are dying because they are using charcoal for cooking on the continent. So, if you consider gas, for example, we all agree that renewable is what we should do, and that's what everyone is pushing. We have all African countries having strategy to do more renewables on the continent, but sometimes we cannot avoid gas just for a transition solution. So we all agree with the phase out of fossil fuel, but using your own words that it has to be just, we have to use solutions that enable us to address those people that are not transitioning from anywhere than zero.
I want to just thank the panelists. I don't know, I'm going to ask Mzizi to close, but just to say it's been very fantastic discussion. It's one of the few places where we actually have been talking about private finance and the role in the just transition. Hopefully, we'll be able to pick this up next year. And then, Mzi, if I can ask you to conclude. Thanks.
Sure. No, thank you very much. Thanks, first of all, to my fellow panelists here. Thanks for making the time, and thank you, colleagues, for joining us. I mean, I think if I reflect a little bit about what I've heard in the last hour or so, I think, if I go back to the exam question that we asked ourselves right at the beginning of what's going to be required to crowd in, I guess, more private sector capital, I think a couple of themes for me have emerged from this session. Number one is around collaboration. I think that came out quite strongly. The second is a point that you made, Khalifa, on the importance of the continent being able to position itself very well externally, especially from a risk-reward perspective, and making sure that we communicate those risk-reward metrics in a compelling way, so that we can tap into larger flows of especially international capital. I think the other theme, I think, which has come out quite strongly is around the importance of what I would broadly call, Africa and African countries having very clear climate transition strategies, and that actually being quite a key lever towards ensuring that as countries we go out into various private sector parties, public sector parties, ODAs, etc., that we position this very well, but it comes from the basis of kind of what is actually our transition strategy, what sectors, what levers are to be pulled, at what time. So the pace aspect is also very important. So I think it's given us a lot of food for thought, and it certainly leaves us as APSA feeling more inspired. Not to say that there wasn't a lack of inspiration before, but certainly feeling more inspired to work even harder, to leverage the networks that we have, the capital that we have, to really be an active force for good. I think this transition is going to require lots of capital and very specialized supports and ideas. And I think that as a firm, we're well positioned to do that. And as I said, feeling very, very inspired after this, and committed to working with all of our stakeholders to get this over the line. So with those words, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mzee. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming, and I just want to give the hand of applause to the panelists. They were great. Thank you very much. It's okay to end 10 minutes early. So.